Dobrodošli u novu epizodu Netokracija Podcasta. Ja sam Ivan, a mi je Nemo u ovoj epizodi. U ovoj epizodi ja intervjuiram Marvina Liao, bivšeg investitora i partnera u Farmeron Startups, jednom od najpoznatijih akceleratora, koji je među ostalim investirao i u Farmeron Matije Kopića i u još neke druge i hrvatske i regionalne i europske i globalne startupe, koji ima preko 20 godina iskustva u tehnološkom ekosistemu, investiranju i startupima. S Marvinom ću pričati o tome što founderi trebaju napraviti kad je u pitanju traženje kapitala, da li trebamo Silicijsku dolinu u Hrvatskoj, ostatku Europe, ali još neki praktični savjeti za bilo koga koji pokreće tehnološku tvrtku ili jednostavno želi u njoj raditi. Naravno, ako želite i buduće epizode Netokracija Podcasta poput ove, subscribe se putem newslettera, putem Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, YouTube-a, kliknite zvonce i čujemo se nakon intervjua. Startups in Eastern Europe. Marvin, if you could tell us, like you've obviously been a part of the ecosystem for years. You've been a partner at Farmeron Startups. You've traveled all around the region. What's your perception about startups from this part of the world in general, like from your experience?
I mean, I'm super, like I put my money where my mouth is, right? So I've invested in quite a lot of companies from the CE region. I'm quite bullish. So even prior to 500 startups, I was at, Yahoo. So I've been very familiar with the region. I've been coming out to the region since 2007, right? So I've been very, very bullish about the region overall. After I left 500 startups end of last year, the goal was actually to spend still continue to come out to the region like every single month. Obviously the pandemic kind of got in the way, but I still have a lot of portfolio companies I'm taking care of from the region, and I'm hoping to make it out there. So I'll actually be heading to Kiev actually this weekend and spending a month out there and probably travel around the region. The goal is I might go to Serbia, I might go to North Macedonia. There's and probably one other place, I'm not sure, right? So the goal is to base myself in Kiev for the next like 4 or 5 weeks and probably travel around the region. So I'm putting my money where my mouth is, of just like I'm very, very bullish on the region. I think there's amazing startups that are underlooked and overlooked.
Mm-hmm. So how are these startups that you've invested in, how are they doing now during the pandemic? How's Eastern Europe looking from your view?
I mean, the thing with a lot of these Eastern European startups that I invest in, so some in Russia, some in Poland, some in, like in Latvia, Estonia, like they're actually, a lot of them are actually doing quite well, right? Because like they were focused on a global market, so they're not focusing on a local market. They're almost, and I have a bunch in Russia too. So like all these companies are like focusing on global markets, and a lot of their customers are in the US.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Is actually like not the pandemic maybe, but is like the whole remote work thing helping startups? Not I don't mean just like the ones that you're invested in, but having in mind that now companies can hire developers or are maybe more open to hiring developers or partners from all around the world. Is remote helping to a point? Like maybe startups don't have to move from where they are?
Well, I think I've always been bullish on remote work, and this really accentuated it, right? So I did a presentation earlier today on just like how if you think about what COVID-19 has done, like it's awful, but yet from a technology perspective, it's forced digitization of a lot of companies and industries that didn't want to do it and now have to do it. And so remote work is actually one of the things where the reality is that even a lot of the big tech companies that were very much like anti-remote work are kind of forced to do it now. So they've been forced to learn this very, very quickly. And I also think for startups, they're able to adjust to it much faster. So I do think the edge goes to startups. There's fewer people they need to sort of like to coordinate with. So I think overall, this is a very good thing for the startup ecosystem. You can find talent anywhere. It's become an edge.
Do you think that being a remote first company is something that startups should use in their pitch deck as an advantage? Like, okay, we're a remote first company, and that gives them some sort of, again, advantage when talking to investors or finding.
I'm not sure about that. I just think it's sort of just from a like the reality is there are a lot of big companies now are becoming sort of remote now, right? Like Pinterest and Twitter and Square are all going to be, and also like what's the other one? Like, I mean, it's just like I go down the list, it's just like there's tons of very, very significant companies now in Silicon Valley that are just like fully remote. So, you know, I don't know if it's the edge that it used to be. I think prior to COVID, it definitely was an edge. I think it's becoming less so as like this becomes sort of like the normality.
Yeah, ubiquitous to every tech company, basically.
Yeah. Or most tech companies.
Yeah. So when talking about skills, you've mentioned in different interviews that obviously Eastern European founders have like engineering skills, have a lot of skills in building tech, but something that in time we've noticed is that a lot of these founders lack marketing skills, sales skills. Has that changed over the years, or is it still an issue? Is this still
Not
something
really?
that...
It's still an issue. It's still an issue. I mean, it's getting better, right? I think that if you think about like startup knowledge in general, it's become much more widespread. And I also think that, you know, due to sort of like things like YC, 500 startups, Techstars, and you go down the list of just like, and all the blog posts out there, a lot of these founders, these Central Eastern European founders who have spent time in Silicon Valley or the US or going back, like just like there's starting to be a broader breadth of skills, right? Like Miro is a, you know, I believe they're from Russia, formerly from Russia. Like they're doing some cool stuff. And so I think like that knowledge is becoming wider spread. And so it's becoming less of an issue, but there's still a gap.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that some founders spent time in Silicon Valley. Do you think that, again, a lot of founders from Croatia, Slovenia, Serbia were of the opinion that in order to either find investors or just like grow as founders, to network at least, they needed to spend some time in the Valley. Has, again, remote changed this? Is it easier to either get meetings or network, or do you still have to move to the like startup centers in order to gain this knowledge network?
So here's the thing. I think that in some ways the playing field has become much more level. So for example, like the advantage of being a founder in Silicon Valley now is a lot less so, at least during pandemic times, because like Zoom call is a Zoom call, right? Like you're not, you know, like I still haven't met up with a lot of my founders here. You know, meeting most founders, like you're just not going to do a live meeting. Generally speaking, I think 80 to 90% of investors are still not comfortable doing sort of like live meetings, right? I think we'll see how next year turns out. But I don't, whoever wins the election, I still think the pandemic's going to be with us for a while. So unfortunately, just like I think we're stuck with this at least for till through the end of 2021. And so I think from a getting meetings part, much easier than ever. But I still think there is something to be said about being around other great founders and being around, you know, being in the environment in general. And so I think once the pandemic is conquered, 2021, 2022, I do think like there will be some semblance of normality. People still want to hang with other people. And so I still think it is still valid, you know, once the pandemic is over, I still think it is valid that spending time in Silicon Valley or New York or any of the other sort of like tech centers still is very helpful.
Mm-hmm. How would you advise founders that do want to at least take advantage of this time when they can remotely contact investors or other founders, how to go about it? Like before, again, it was go to a conference, and even, I mean, you've been to How to Web like I have, like unlike US or Western conferences when you're a speaker and everyone comes in later and asks questions. In Eastern Europe, that's not the case. Like most, even founders are a bit, well, let's call them shy. But is it now a case of like sending more emails? Is it the case of getting intros? Is it a case of being active on Twitter?
Both, right? Sending more emails and getting intros, like that was important before, probably becomes even more important now.
Mm-hmm. Are there some things that you think that Eastern European founders can leverage as an advantage when contacting investors, either putting an emphasis on engineering talent in the region or something else that they might not think of?
I'm not sure there is sort of some secret sauce here. I think learning to do Zoom calls well is important, like learning how to run Zoom meetings, like be good on Zoom. It is a very different thing, right? Like being on video is just like you miss a lot of cues. There's always these delays and technical things, and how you structure your meetings on Zoom. I think there's an art and a science to it. And so learning how to do that well is really important. So energy level stuff, right? Like emoting more, being sort of like emphasizing things like a lot more heavily. I think it's a skill set that I think they can learn. And I think that's like the Zoom is a whole new environment, right? Like Zoom, any other video call, it's a whole different environment of use.
Mm-hmm. do you have some example of founders who have, well, mastered either sales or the synergy or, well, Zoom calls in practical sense that
Not
you
yet.
can give it?
I would say not yet. Not yet. It's
Yeah.
still pretty awful. And this isn't just Central Eastern Europe region. I'm talking like globally, like even in the US, like I don't think people have mastered it yet. We're still figuring it out. Like if you think about, we're only like about, the pandemic was like March, right? So at least hit the US March. So like we're only like 7 months into this, right? Half month. We're like, I think a lot of us founders and investors still trying to figure this stuff out. So it's still early days.
We've had a lot of like success in Croatia with some new companies, or not new companies, but companies that have now, after years of work, been let's say confirmed to be successful. So like Infobeep, who's become a unicorn after 14 years and stuff like that. And most of these companies are B2B, right? They're doing either enterprise software or R&D, stuff like that. And some founders are still wary that it's still impossible to create a B2C product from Eastern Europe because, again, we don't have the know-how and there are not a lot of examples of this. What's your opinion?
I mean, Reface, right, is a Ukrainian company. So, I mean, I think it's possible. I don't think it's impossible, but I do think the odds are, in general, are better in B2B, right? If you look at most, like you nailed it, like just look at the data sample set of just like, well, most of the super successful companies, even most of my Central Eastern European portfolio, mainly B2B. So I've seen very few consumer focused, not impossible. Reface is Ukrainian. Like there are consumer companies. I think there is a potential, but I think a big part is just the lack of the sales and marketing piece. And I think particularly the marketing stuff, but it's changing. I think it will change. I think you will see some sort of like really, really crazy, interesting, good consumer focused companies come out of the CE region, but I think it's going to be a while. I do think majority of them will still be B2B companies. I mean, look, I've seen all of the above work. I do think though that it is better to get somebody that actually knows the business. But having said that, at the end of the day, you can build a sales machine if you actually become a sales machine yourself. So I do think founders do need to learn the skill of sales, right? And sales management themselves, and then hire in and learning how to sort of build the sales process themselves, at least the basics of it. There's a lot of books like Sales Machine, Ultimate Sales Machine, Predictable Revenue. Like there's just a lot of books out there and there's a lot of stuff online that you can learn at least basic frameworks, and then implementing themselves, making a lot of mistakes, that's okay. But the whole idea is just like learn to do this stuff, at least the basics, and then hire people into this. And so whether you're hiring from offline, whether you're hiring from SaaS, like, I've seen both work. I mean, the question that comes down to sort of like, why you're trying to target local customers, or like whatever the customer you're targeting, whether it's international or local. Because for me, the biggest thing is just like, what are you learning, right? So if you're targeting local customers and you're just because you think it's low hanging fruit and it's easier to get money in and learn some stuff, that's okay. But I do think at the end of the day, there's a money piece and there's a learning piece. If you're doing it because you think it's easier to close it and get money, then that's fine. I think that's okay, because sometimes you just need money in to validate. But there is a school of thought, which is if you close them and everything you're learning, like how, what to build for them, are their needs sort of like similar to sort of like companies outside for your ultimate market. If it's not the same, you are wasting time. What I'm saying is just like, are you learning stuff that's applicable to a larger market? And if it's not applicable to a larger market, you're probably wasting time. General points, I think that they, like it's very decisive. So in the sense of just like they move quickly, they make decisions, even if like 80% of the data is there, they'll still make hard decisions. They fix their problems very quickly. The other thing too is just like I said, global minded from the beginning. So like their ambition level is very, very high. So, it's, and also just like willingness to go and like pick up and learn the sales and marketing stuff, right? Like they're willing to do the hard work and the critical hard work. And they're willing to sort of step out of their comfort zone, right? And a lot of folks like, I'm a technical person. I'm just, I don't want to do this. I want somebody else to go do this. I think they're willing to go and do the hard stuff. The reality is that if you're doing a startup, you're probably unrealistic anyways, because your odds are not necessarily that high. But that's also like, I do think it is important to sort of think big, right? Because you're like, the way I think about it is that if you're going to go work on something, like work on something big, right? Like otherwise, what's the point of what you're doing? But at the same time, you also want to break that down into small pieces. And so, there's this great saying in Silicon Valley. It's like, never mistake a short, like a clear view for a short distance. And so it's just like, I want to see a global grand vision, but I also want to see how you break it up into sort of like bite-sized pieces. So there needs to be some level of sort of like ambition with sort of like realism. I think like a lot of the skill set that you learn in an established company and established sort of like market may not be applicable to a startup. And so like like it's a completely different skill set and different utilization of sort of sales and marketing, because you're ultimately selling a product that may or may not be fully baked yet, versus when you're at a big company, it's almost always like you have set customers, the business model makes sense. Like things are very, very clear. There, working in a startup environment, there's a lot of things that haven't been figured out yet. And so your job is to sort of explore and figure that out. Very different mindset, very different skill set. And so the other way to do this is volunteer, right? Like still keep your day job and volunteer on the side and advise as a volunteer, angel invest. There's a lot of different ways you can actually build that skill set. Yeah, being a mentor. Yeah, being a mentor. But just being very, very careful as a mentor and an investor. The biggest goal is like, that old doctor saying is like, do no harm, because a lot of the advice that you're giving may not be very good. And so you want to be very careful about the advice you're giving to a startup, because like I think back of leaving Yahoo and being a mentor prior to joining 500 and just like mentoring a lot of different startup accelerators. I'm not sure the advice I gave was very, very good, because I had to learn a lot of stuff. I'm like, oh, well, actually, it made sense at a big company like Yahoo, but totally doesn't make sense for you as an early stage company. I had to learn a lot of that stuff. So now I look back, I'm like, yeah, I may not have given great advice and, sort of straight out of a big company. And so just understand sort of like do no harm. So you have to be very careful, but you can be helpful in these specific situations, or, making sure that you're adjusting your advice for early stage startups. But I do think that's a great way to learn. That's how I learned. I think my skill set was a little bit different too, because I worked for a startup for like 2 years before I joined Yahoo too, right? So, definitely had some background in that area. But one of the things I'll say is just understand that there's just very different phases of companies. And so understanding sort of like the startup phase of just like, there's this saying of just like, the commando stage, there's an infantry phase, and there's a policeman phase, and just understanding what phase you're coming in from and understanding what phase that you're better suited for, right? So for somebody like me, I'm good, I think, at the commando stage. I think I'm really good at the infantry stage. I'm awful, and I have no interest in the policeman's phase. And this is where I see like, my career has broken down, was when a company reaches a certain phase. So when in my first startup I was an early employee, like number 17 or 18, the company went to 150 people. So it was always sort of still the commando phase. I really thrived there. At Yahoo, I joined in sort of like the late commando, early infantry phase, and was thrived up until sort of like it really became a policeman phase. And even at 500, like I joined as a very early, as a partner when the company was like 30 people, and watching this company go to 150 people when honestly started bringing in policemen became less fun, right? So just like phases, understanding the phase that you really thrive in, that is also helpful. So and I don't know many people that are good at all three of these phases. I guess learning which phase you're good at, what phase you like to do, I think is really important. I do think sort of like you want to take it a little bit slow in this area, and I think you also want to be very careful about hiring from brand names. So, for example, you want to look at the person's background, like have they been through sort of like a similar situation of just like the scaling phase, right? Like, so this is a mistake that a lot of founders make, of just like particularly in the B2B space. So they go, okay, like, I'm in the space, I'm scaling now. So like 50 people, we need to get to like 150, 250 people. But then what they end up doing is that they go, well, you know what? Like I'm looking for people, like you're going to hire people from like Oracle or from like Salesforce or Google, right? And you're like, that makes no sense. Like if you're looking for people that went through a very similar phase at Google or Salesforce or whatever in the early days, who went through that. Not that you could, because these people are probably all retired, right? But like you're looking for people who have some similar background. But if you hire somebody now, you're like, well, these people have like, like they've inherited a lot of things. These companies are all like 100,000 people. And so like it's a phase thing, right? And so just like understanding, so like, did they go through sort of like the right phase? Brand names may not be as important in situations like this. And I think a lot of people make the mistake of actually hiring from brand names. There's no one customer, there's no one accelerator, there's no one investor, there's no one hire that's going to make or break your business. Like it's a combination of all these things, right? And so what I'll say is like, look, most of the companies that have gone in my accelerator, most of them will still not be successful, right? Like it's really, really hard. And so, and also I think if you're relying on somebody to go build your business for you, you shouldn't be a founder. Like everything's, it's on you, right? As the founder, nobody's going to make or break your business. No one thing's going to make or break your business. The only thing's going to make or business is you and your co-founders.
In Europe, some parts of the ecosystem have always thought that we need to create our own like Silicon Valleys, either in Croatia, Romania, Ukraine, doesn't even matter. Again, with the pandemic going on, with everyone being remote, is there such a thing of creating a local Silicon Valley, or have we finally come to the phase where, okay, Silicon Valley is something very specific, and then as far as these local ecosystems go, we need to do things differently for the local founders?
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment. I think this idea of just like recreating Silicon Valley is just stupid. It's impossible and it's stupid. And the reality is just like, I think the next Silicon Valley is remote, right? Like I'm actually going to write about that, but I really think like the next Silicon Valley is remote. And I think what's going to happen is just like Silicon Valley, the way I think about this is like Silicon Valley is like this hub, right? And then you're going to have all these like spokes to all these like different regions, and founders are going to come in and out, investors are going to go in and out. And so this idea, just like, I think that's just like, we're all interrelated and interconnected. And so this idea, just like, it's a Silicon Valley mindset of just like, wherever you're from, you're just always hopefully have ties to New York and LA and San Francisco Bay Area, Berlin, London, Stockholm, like just like, I think they're all going to be tied together. And so you're going to see movement of people going back and forth. And this idea of just like recreating and having your own Silicon Valley in wherever, right? Like Serbia, Croatia, like in Moscow, wherever, I think it's just dumb. It doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm. As far as to add to that question, when choosing investors, so we had a situation where, again, founders would be able to find investors from the US only at conferences or pitch them in different hubs like Berlin or San Francisco. In 2020, do you think that location plays a part as far as investors go? Because some founders are wary of choosing like local investors because of the lack of experience maybe with tech products, so on. While on the other hand, like some funds might not be as available. Where are you when it comes to choosing like local investors or investors from the rest of Europe or the US? Does it make a difference?
I don't think it does. I mean, I just think that investors, at least I can speak from an investor perspective, I think like a lot of the globetrotting that many of us did before is just becoming much more standard. Like a lot of top tier firms like Lightspeed and Kleiner and Union Square are like, these are awesome US firms, are like starting to spend more time in Europe, for example, right? So like you're starting to see US firms going to Europe now. And so I do think you're seeing some like flattening and globalization in general of just like interest. And I'm seeing, for example, a lot of investments like going into like Australia and New Zealand from like US firms. So you're starting to see some globalization overall. And this competition, I think, is ultimately good. I think for founders where it's just like, I think you're trying to, where possible, you're trying to optimize for the best investors that you can partner with to help you grow your business, whether they're locally in London or in the US, doesn't really matter. I think like the world is flattening. I can honestly say it finally seems to be flattening, or directionally is really going that direction. So you want to optimize where possible for a good partner, right? A good investment partner, that could be locally, in your backyard, or it could be somewhere else. But I think like that's how you should be thinking about it, and you shouldn't care where they're from.
Mm-hmm. On the other hand, a lot of founders seem to be, especially now with like the whole crisis around the pandemic, are struggling in terms of funding. They want to find money if it's even if it's not smart money. Do you think that's a smart decision, or should they go about it some other way?
Well, I think that, fundraising is always hard in general. It doesn't matter where you're from and what country you're from and how good as a founder you are. It's always hard. But I do think like because things have flattened and investors are much more open to talking to people from anywhere else now, I think it behooves them to at least try to reach out to folks, whether it's through cold email or, in my opinion, it's still better, just like utilize your network and find ways to get introductions to them where possible, right? Like, and so like, just be creative and find ways to get to people, and maybe just follow them on Twitter and try to engage people, engage with some of these investors on Twitter, but just be smart about it and do your homework.
Yeah, I think like there was a phase when like AngelList was very new, and some founders took advantage of that, just knowing that, okay, if I'm early on the platform, I'll get intros before others. I think it's the same with any digital platform, and a lot of founders just aren't as active on, for example, Twitter, where of course a lot of investors are active, just because it's not as popular maybe in Croatia like it's in the rest of the world or something.
Well, you fish where the fish are.
Yeah. How important do you think timing is for startups, especially now? Like, just having in mind that they need to either have war chest to survive, or maybe take advantage of some trend like remote or AI or something. How important is timing for startups, or should they take their time and just like go about it step by step?
I think number one is a combination of like timing is important. So you want to take advantage of any opportunities that you have in front of you, but also at the same time, like you can only push things so far too. So try to be aggressive, where possible, to take advantage of these opportunities that show up, but at the same time also be systematic, right? So I'm not saying like take it slow, but I think at the same time you also have to be, I think startups also have to be realistic to the point where just like, okay, like, it's an awful saying for a guy, but it's just like, look, you can't have a baby any faster than like 9 months, right? Like, just like sometimes stuff just takes as long as it does. And so make sure you're very systematic about like doing that and being realistic of just like, but you also have to push really hard at the same time. And so I do think about that a lot of just like, be aggressive, but also be sort of pragmatic at the same time. Most times, like product market fit takes like 2 to 4 years. So it's not going to take anything earlier than that, but you should also be somewhat impatient and push really hard to see if you can actually beat that, right? But also in your own mind, understand like you don't want to crush yourself of just like, oh, I'm going to have product market fit like in 2 months. Like that's impossible. Like just like that just doesn't happen. And so it's kind of, it's a balance.
Mm-hmm. Any end advice for our founders listening to the podcast for 2020?
I mean, just make sure that you know what you're trying to, like focus on customers, make sure that sort of like you're working on something that you really care about. And I would say number 3, just like decide what path you want to go down. You don't necessarily need to go and like raise money, right? Like raising, like where possible, try to get your money from customers. That is always better than trying to raise money for investors. And so, the default for a lot of founders, I'm going to go raise VC money. That may not be the right thing for you for what you're trying to build, or for what the type of company you're trying to build. And so just be thoughtful about the path that you're trying to take, because once you go down the path of raising VC money and even having successfully raised it, it's very hard to get off that path. So just be thoughtful about what you're trying to build.
Awesome. Thanks, Marvin. So for founders or other people that want to find you online, where can they find you?
Just like Twitter is probably best, or I have a newsletter, which is hardfork.substack.com. That's it. Pretty simple.
So you've become one of those newsletter hipsters and offers.
Like the newsletter is just like, there's no business model to it. I'm just trying to hopefully help more people, right? In a little bit of a scalable way, and also just for me personally, like it's a personal project of just like jotting down a lot of your thoughts and things you've learned over the last, I don't know, 21 years for me in tech. And so just like hoping that this will be helpful and interesting for people.
Awesome. Sharing knowledge is always important, especially for founders. Thank you so much for being a part of the Netokracija Podcast, and hopefully talk to you soon.
Yes, thanks for having me. And good luck, everyone.
Ovo je bio intervju sa Marvinom Liaom. Nadam se da vam se svidio oko malo drugačiji format nego što inače imamo na Netokracija podcastu. Ako želite još ovakvih intervjua s još nekim ljudima koji su vam zanimljivi, javite. Jako me zapravo zanima tko bi vas zanimao. A ako želite čuti o takvim novim epizodama, naravno kao i uvijek subscribe-te se putem YouTube-a, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify i svih drugih mogućih servisa. Čujemo se u sljedećoj epizodi Netokracija Podcasta.